Welcome back, children. In the last video we learned about the economic reforms, reasons for the economic reforms, and we learned that India adopted the new economic policy with the stabilization and the structural reform measures. Now in this class we are going to learn what all things comes under the new economic policies, what are the measures which were introduced under the new economic policies. It was based on stabilization and structural reform measures, but we need to learn what all policies comes under the new economic policy. So the second topic is new economic policy. Now the policies under new economic policy. Now three main policies comes under the new economic policy. The first one is liberalization, second one is privatization, and the third one is globalization. Now the three major policies of new economic policy were liberalization, privatization and globalization, and among these three I very well know that you are familiar with the term globalization, which you have learned in class 10. Now we will begin with liberalization. What is meant by liberalization? So liberalization is the first measure, first policy that we are going to begin today. Now what is meant by this liberalization? So from the word itself the meaning is very clear, freedom. It is known as freedom. Now what is that actually implying? Now it means removal of entry and growth restrictions. You have to read it together. Removal of entry and growth restrictions. We are removing all kinds of restrictions which were imposed in entry and growth. Removing of all the entry and growth restrictions. So when you read that statement, you have to read it like this: removal of entry and growth restrictions on the private sector. That means private sector will be given more involvement in the economy. Now you can remember that was one first condition in which India was granted the loan amount by IMF and the World Bank. Private sector should be given freedom to make investments in the economy. Then only economy can shoot up. Okay, so liberalization means removal of all kind of entry and growth restrictions for whom? On the private sector. That means private sector should be given more freedom for entry as well as for growth. Their growth and entry restrictions should be removed by the government. That is known as liberalization. Freedom for the private sectors to function in the economy. Now, what were the objectives of liberalization? Point number one, a reduction of government control and greater freedom of private investment. So from the word itself it is clear. There is no need of much explanation for that. Freedom of private sector enterprises and reducing the control of government sector enterprises. Government control should be reduced. Private sectors should be given freedom to come up with more and more investments. Only if they are given freedom they will come up with more investments and undertakings. So that has to be, all kinds of restrictions on private sector has to be removed. Now next one is business will be free hand and allowed to run on commercial lines. What do you mean by that? Business has to run on commercial lines. In fact it means all kinds of imports and exports has to be encouraged. How a business function on commercial lines? With the help of money flowing inside as well as outside. That means both export as well as import has to take place. No kind of any restrictions like quota or tariff has to be there. Everything has to be removed. That was the main objective of liberalization. Now with that objective, what purpose government can fulfill with that? That is the next topic, purpose of liberalization. So with the objectives set for liberalization, what all purpose, what can be fulfilled by the government? First one, the purpose is to unlock economic potential by encouraging MNCs and other private sectors. What do you mean by that? To unlock the economic potential. When we lock the economic potential, what will happen? An economy cannot grow. Just as an example of a child who is having a lot of talents, if he is not able to develop his talents, what will happen? Nobody will know about it. He can't develop his talent. He will not get a chance. So what obviously we do in order to encourage a child? Now thousands of people, if the child is talented, thousands of people should know about him. So we will try to encourage a child by giving certain chances to open up himself, isn't it? So all kinds of encouragements will be given by us for the development of the child. So likewise as a case of a child or a person, economy should also have some potential. So don't lock that potential of economy. Potential of the economy has to be unlocked. How can we unlock the potential of economy? By encouraging the export and import. That is the only way which we can unlock the potential of an economy. So through import and export, economic potential will be unlocked, and more with the encouragement of export and import, more and more companies will be doing investments in our country, and we can also make investments in other countries. So to unlock the economic potential, we are just unlocking the economic potential by, how we are unlocking? By encouraging MNCs and other private sectors to grow in our economy. We are unlocking the economic potential of our country. We are not locking it. We should not lock it. We have to unlock it by encouraging what all things? By encouraging more and more multinational companies to our country, and also by the growth of private sectors in our country. This will boost up the investment in the economy. Now next one, the purpose of liberalization is to introduce much more competition in the economy and increasing the efficiency of operations. Now with the liberalization, what purpose can be fulfilled by the government? Introduce much more competition. That means if there are no restrictions, export and import will take place. If there is import, the domestic producers will be very vigilant. They will improve the quality of their product. High competition will be there. Reduction of price can take place. So only with this liberalization, this objective can be fulfilled. So that was the next purpose of liberalization, to increase the competitiveness in the market, in the economy, and increasing the efficiency of operations. What do you mean by that? If the domestic producers are facing the competition from outside, they will improve the quality of their product. When they improve the quality of their product, efficiency of operations also will increase, because they are dealing with the goods from outside, not only of the domestic territory alone. They are crossing the boundary. They are dealing with other products also. So this will increase the efficiency of operations. So liberalization means freedom of movement of goods, services, as well as development of private sectors. Now let us see what all economic reform measures that comes under liberalization. So I hope the objective and the purpose of liberalization is clear to you. Next we will move on to economic reforms under liberalization. So I hope that the topic is very clear to you. New economic policy consists of liberalization, privatization and globalization. Now we are dealing with liberalization. Under liberalization, what all economic reform measures are there? That is what we are going to learn. Under liberalization, the first one is industrial sector reforms, the second one is financial sector reforms, third one is tax reforms, fourth one is foreign exchange reforms, and fifth one is trade and investment policy reforms. In all these areas, how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. In 5 areas, liberalization was granted by the government. Now, in this session, we will concentrate on the first 2 areas of reforms that comes under liberalization, that is industrial sector reforms and finance sector reforms. Okay. Now, we will move on to the first one, industrial sector reforms. Now, you know that industrial sector reforms, IPR, just recollect what all things you have learned in the last few classes. In the last chapter, industrial policy resolution, which was introduced by the government in 1956, in which industries were divided into 3 schedules, Schedule A, Schedule B and Schedule C. Schedule A completely owned by the government, Schedule B basement will be laid by the government, which has to be carried and supported by the private sector, and Schedule C which is undertaken only by the private sectors. And in Schedule A, we learned that almost 17 industries were under the control of the government. So, recollect all those points. So many reforms were made by the government during the planning period. All those things are going to get changed now with this liberalization. So, recollect all those points that you have learned in the previous classes. Now, which are the major industrial sector reforms? The new industrial policy was introduced in 1991. Now, during the planning period, you know, industrial policy resolution was passed in the year 1956. Now, during the economic reform in 1991, the new industrial policy was introduced. Now, let us see what was the main emphasis, what was the main topic under this industrial policy of 1991. Point number A, reduction in the industrial licensing. Now, remember what all things you have learned in the second chapter. Government introduced Industrial Licensing Act. In that, each and every industry can start only with the license from the government. In order to expand their branch, they have to get the license from the government to produce diversified products. What do you mean by that? Remember the example which I gave in the previous class. What was it? If a company is producing toothbrush, it can start the diversified products such as toothpaste and so on. So, diversified products. So, for all these, license was compulsory during the planning period under the industrial policy resolution. Now, with the new industrial policy in 1991, all those restrictions, all those things were removed. Let us see what is it. A reduction in the industrial licensing. What is it? No licensing needed to set up new industries except for industries related to strategic and security considered. What do you mean by that? No need of license for industries to start. Now, you remember what was a major drawback of licensing when India adopted the Licensing Act during the year 1956. Big industrialists, they prevented the license of small industrialists. There was a long time taken for the granting of license, therefore, the investors had to wait a long time for getting the license. All these were the major problems associated with the licensing. You can remember all those things. That was a major problems associated with the industrial licensing. But here, no such problems are there. No need of licensing for any industries to start except those industries which are concerned with safety and security. For example, liquor, defense equipments and as well as industrial explosives. So, those industries which are related to the manufacturing of liquor, defense equipments and industrial explosive, they only need the licensing from the government. They definitely need the licensing from the government. Why? Because they are those industries which are concerned with the strategic and security considerations. Let us take the example of industrial explosives. Which are the industrial explosive? Nitrogen explosive, water gel explosive and slurries. They are especially used in which all areas? Mining and quarrying. So, for this mining and quarrying to take place, these explosives are necessary because people are working on it. They are using the technology. Therefore, these explosives, once they are being manufactured, it affects the security of the people who are managing it with the technology. Therefore, it needs the licensing from the government. Only for those areas, certain areas, licensing was considered to be compulsory. For the rest of the areas, there was no need of licensing. Even to start the business, then even to expand, no license were needed to expand and no license was needed to diversification of products due to time lag, because lot of time was taken to grant the license. So, license was not required to start a business or to expand a business or to do diversified products. Now, next that comes under the industrial sector is reform. Under liberalization is decrease in the role of public sector. Decrease the role of public sector. Government should reduce its role. Remember Schedule A under the industrial policy resolution, 17 industries were controlled by the government sector. With the new industrial policy in 1991, number of industries which are directly controlled by the government was reduced to 3. From where? From 17 it was reduced to 3. That was a major change. As per IPR, in Schedule 1, 17 industries will be directly under the control of the government, but now instead of 17, it is reduced to 3. Now, let us see which are the 3 industries which have to be handled exclusively by the government. That is a monopoly of the government. It is not the monopoly of the private. Let us see which are the defense equipments, railway transport and atomic energy generation. Very, very important from the examination point of view. You have to remember which all were the 3 industries that was taken care by the government due to the new industrial policy of 1991. Now, next reform measure, next liberalization measure under the industrial sector was de-reservation under small scale industries. What do you mean by that? Now, you can very well remember what government did to improve the small scale industries under the Industries Act in the second chapter, in the last chapter. In order to encourage the small scale industries, certain goods were permitted to be produced only by the small scale industries. Large scale industries were not given permission to produce that. Why such measure was taken by the government? Because government wanted the small scale industries also to grow in the economy. That was the main purpose. So, all those measures, all those goods which were given exclusively for small scale industries were taken away. Now, small scale industries are free to produce anything. Now, large scale industries also can produce those goods which were produced by the small scale industries. No products are reserved for small scale industries. They are de-reserved. Now, so products of goods are de-reserved. No reservation of products for small scale industries. Now, second which comes under that particular point is investment increased up to 1 crore. It was only 5 lakhs initially, but an investment of small scale industries is set up to 1 crore. Therefore, you can just imagine what will be the investment granted for a large scale industries, more than that, right? Now, next one is price determined by the market forces of demand and supply. Whatever is produced by the industries, goods and services produced by the industries, its price is determined by the market forces of demand and supply. You know that very well. It is not determined by the government. Government doesn't have any role to fix that. As it is produced by the private sector, the private sectors will determine the price on the basis of the forces of demand and supply. So, as the goods and services are produced by the private sectors, government doesn't have any role in fixing the price for that. The price is fixed by them due to the market forces of demand and supply. So, this comes under that. Next one is Mrtp Act under the industrial sector of liberalization measure. Next is Mrtp Act. What is Mrtp Act? Monopoly and restrictive trade practices. Monopoly and restrictive trade practices. What is under this act? Under this act, large companies need not seek any prior approval for expansion. Large scale industries, large companies, it is just equal to the licensing point that we learned in this particular area. License is not required for the expansion of big industries. Now, next one is establishment of new undertakings. The large scale industries doesn't want any licensing for undertaking the new establishments or for the establishment of new undertakings. Okay, now and they are free to do the amalgamation also. What is meant by amalgamation? Now big industries will join with other industries. That process is known as amalgamation. A joint venture or merging with some other companies is known as amalgamation. Amalgamation was also granted during that period. Amalgamation can be done not only with the domestic industries but also with the industries outside. One such example of amalgamation is Maruti, which is based in India, and Suzuki, which is based in Japan. So it will function as Maruti Suzuki India Limited. A kind of amalgamation has taken place. So with this Mrtp Act, what is possible? Amalgamation was possible. Therefore, an Indian company will have its root in the foreign countries also. A merging is taking place. The best example that you can write for the exam is Maruti Suzuki. Next we will move on to the financial reform. So let me take that slides once again. That is, liberalization consists of industrial sector reforms, financial sector reforms, tax reforms, foreign exchange reforms and industrial trade investment policy reforms. Now we started discussing with industrial reforms. The first one, under the industrial reforms we learned what all points? Industrial reforms are reduction in the industrial licensing, no licensing needed to start, expand or diversified products. Point number B, decrease in the role of public sector. Role of public sector has to be decreased. The next one, de-reservation under small scale industries. Small scale industries are not supposed to get any products to be produced under their reservation. There is no reservation of products for small scale industries. And the next point is Mrtp Act. All these comes under industrial sector. So the first part of liberalization, industrial sector, is over. We are moving on to the reform in financial sector. So second one is financial sector reforms. I can take that chart once again for you. We are going to discuss the financial sector reforms. Okay. Now let us see what all changes were made in the finance sector. Financial sector reforms consist of 4 points. Point number 1, financial sector reforms. Now what all things comes under financial sector? Banks, financial institutions, foreign exchange market, all these comes under financial sector. Okay, so many reforms were made by the government in the economic reform period with regard to financial sector. Let us see what all changes were made by the government in the financial sector. Point number 1, change in the role of RBI from regulator to a facilitator. What is the RBI's role now? From a regulator to a facilitator. Okay, RBI will give all the support for other banks to function. RBI will not regulate, it will only facilitate their function. That means what? RBI has given freedom for other banks to function in their way based on certain policies and norms. So RBI will not be controlling them to a great extent. RBI will be just a facilitator for other banks to function in the economy. That was the first financial sector reforms made by the government. Now, second point under financial sector reform is origin of private banks. With the freedom given for the other banks by the RBI, entry of other banks also came into existence. Other private banks, for example ICICI, foreign banks also began to enter into the Indian economy like HSBC. So, being RBI as a facilitator, other banks also got freedom to enter into the market. RBI will function as a facilitator instead of a regulator. So, this caused for the entry of other banks also into the economy, like other private banks as well as the banks from the foreign countries began to root in India. The next one is ease in the expansion process. is in the expansion process. Commercial banks, other private banks, they need not wait for the RBI to grant permission for their expansion. If they want to expand, they can do it even without the permission of the RBI because of the time consuming and so many other issues. So they have the freedom, full freedom to expand their branches. This was one financial sector reform which was undertaken in the year 1991 under liberalization of new economic policy. Now the next one is increase in the foreign investment. Now foreign investment always can create the foreign exchange reserves. Okay. Now many of the foreign institutional investors, FII, they were given freedom to invest in our country. The main result of those investments are MNCs which are functioning in our country. What is the main benefit of that? If the foreign investors are investing in our country, the foreign exchange reserves can be increased. Likewise, the foreign exchange reserves increased up to 51% during that time period. That was a positive sign which was reflected due to the financial sector reform in India. During that time period, the foreign investment increased up to 51%. So all kinds of foreign institutional investors were encouraged to make the investments in India and to increase what? Foreign exchange reserve, because you know during the problems, crisis, financial crisis, the major problem was India didn't have that much of foreign exchange reserves. That was the problem that we discussed. Do you remember that? So in order to remove that particular problem, more foreign exchange reserves are required for India. How can we acquire foreign exchange reserves? From buying from the foreign exchange market as well as by encouraging the foreign investments in our country. So that was the major financial sector reforms. So financial sector reforms under liberalization of new economic policy consisted of change in the role of RBI from regulator to a facilitator, origin of private banks like ICICI and HSBC, then ease in expansion process, freedom for expanding the branches, and finally increase in the foreign investments which experienced up to 51% during that time period. So with this we have finished the first two major measures of liberalization under new economic policy. Hope it is clear to you. Thank you.